John is a 12-year-old autistic boy who faces daily challenges in communicating with those around him. Despite the difficulties and prejudice, he has an extraordinary talent: mathematics. His father, Ethan, is the only one who understands his world and believes in his potential. Together, they prepare for a journey that goes far beyond numbers, in search of something greater. But will John's brilliance be enough to overcome the obstacles ahead? Ethan Parker, a 35-year-old former construction worker, had always known his son, John, was special. With his deep blue eyes and a head of messy brown hair, John stood out not for his appearance, but for the quiet way he absorbed the world. Diagnosed with autism at the age of 3, John communicated with short, fragmented sentences and was exceptionally sensitive to changes in his environment. After losing his wife, Emily, to a car accident when John was just 6, Ethan found himself thrust into the role of a sole parent. This wasn't the life he'd imagined, but every time he looked at John, he knew he had to be both mother and father, guardian and friend. Ethan's parents, Robert and Margaret, lived nearby and offered as much support as they could. The boy had grown attached to them, but the connection he shared with his father was something indescribably deep. Most days, Ethan and John spent hours in their small kitchen, which doubled as a study area. John rarely spoke to others besides Ethan and his grandparents. His difficulty in socializing and communicating made him an easy target for isolation and misunderstanding. However, what John lacked in social skills, he made up for in something extraordinary: an inexplicable mastery over numbers. Ethan first noticed it one rainy afternoon. He had been sorting through old bills, sighing at the growing stack of late payments. As he tapped numbers into a calculator, John, who had been sitting quietly at the kitchen table with a worn-out puzzle, suddenly looked up. "It's wrong," John said, his voice barely above a whisper. Ethan paused, staring at his son. "What's wrong, buddy?" he asked gently. John pointed to the paper. "The number? You added wrong." Ethan blinked in surprise. He had spent years trying to connect with his son, to find some shared interest or activity. And now, out of nowhere, John had corrected his math. Curiously, Ethan pushed the paper toward him. "Okay, show me," he encouraged, hiding his doubt. John's hands trembled slightly as he grabbed a pencil, his movements deliberate and focused. In less than a minute, he scribbled down numbers, effortlessly performing the calculation in his head. Ethan checked the result. It was spot on. Shocked and intrigued, Ethan decided to test John further. He grabbed a deck of cards from the drawer and started laying them out in patterns, asking John to count, add, or subtract them. Each time, John answered without hesitation, his eyes fixed on the numbers, as if they were familiar friends. From that day forward, Ethan began nurturing John's talent. Their mornings now included mental math games, pattern recognition exercises, and even puzzles that Ethan found online. It was as if a new world had opened up for John. Although he still struggled with conversation and eye contact, when numbers were involved, his confidence soared. It was the first time Ethan had seen such a clear passion in his son since the death of his wife. He couldn't help but feel that Emily was watching over them, guiding John towards something greater. Then one day, Ethan came across a flyer at the local grocery store. It advertised the National Junior Mathematics Competition, a prestigious event known for its intense challenges and high standards. Ethan hesitated, staring at the flyer as his heart raced. Could John really do this? Could his son, who barely communicated with others and struggled in most social settings, stand on a stage in front of an audience and compete? It seemed impossible, but Ethan knew they had to try. If there was one thing he'd learned from parenting alone, it was that giving up was not an option. If you're feeling inspired by John's journey so far, make sure to give this video a thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next part of this incredible story. There's more to come, and you won't want to miss how John faces his biggest challenge yet. The first challenge was getting John to practice in more formal settings. They spent afternoons at the town library, where Ethan would gently encourage John to solve problems on a whiteboard. Most of the time they were alone, but occasionally a librarian or a curious passerby would stop to watch. John tensed up during those moments, clutching his markers with white-knuckled fingers, his eyes darting around in panic. Ethan would kneel beside him, whispering words of comfort. "It's okay, buddy. Just focus on the numbers. You're doing great." Slowly, John began to relax. The real test, however, came when they decided to enter a local math contest as a warm-up to the national event. It was a modest competition held in the cafeteria of the community center, but to Ethan and John, it was a battlefield. As they arrived, Ethan felt the weight of judgmental stares. Other parents whispered among themselves, glancing at John, who was clutching his notebook to his chest. Some of them recognized the signs of his condition, and the pity in their eyes was unmistakable. When the contest began, John sat at his designated spot, his eyes fixed on the paper in front of him. Ethan watched from a distance, his heart pounding. He knew this wasn't just about winning. It was about breaking down the barriers that had boxed John in for so long. As the minutes ticked by, John worked through the problems methodically. When the time was up, he handed in his paper, his eyes avoiding the judges as he hurried back to his father's side. The announcement of the results felt like an eternity. Ethan held his breath as the names were read out. 3rd place, 2nd place, then 1st place, John Parker. The room fell silent for a moment before the applause broke out. John stood there, frozen, not sure how to react. Ethan rushed to his side, wrapping him in a bear hug. "You did it, buddy," he exclaimed, tears streaming down his face. It wasn't just a victory in the contest. It was a victory against all odds, against every challenge life had thrown at them. But this was only the beginning. Ethan knew the national competition would be far more difficult, filled with obstacles that would test both his and John's limits. Yet, for the first time in a long while, he felt a glimmer of hope. They would face whatever came next, together. The weeks following John's local competition victory brought a whirlwind of emotions. Ethan was overwhelmed with pride, but a new wave of worry settled in his heart. The national competition was just a few months away, and it wasn't just John's mathematical ability that needed preparation. They had financial hurdles to overcome. Participation fees, travel costs, and the need for a suitable wardrobe for John were all weighing heavily on Ethan's mind. As a former construction worker, Ethan had been surviving on a modest income, supplemented occasionally by side jobs. Most of his savings had dwindled away in the years after Emily's passing, covering bills, therapy sessions for John, and basic necessities. Now, with the competition looming, he needed to find a way to provide the support his son required. John, on the other hand, was oblivious to the challenges they faced. His world revolved around numbers, puzzles, and the time he spent with his father and grandparents. Social interaction outside this small circle was a daunting task for him. Each day, Ethan would practice with John, scribbling math problems on sheets of paper. When the math competitions appeared on TV, Ethan would set up a small practice area in their living room, trying to simulate the environment that John would face at the nationals. Yet every time John was asked to work in front of anyone other than his father, he would freeze, his hands trembling as he gripped his pen, the familiar light in his eyes dimming with anxiety. Ethan knew they needed more than just practice. John had to break out of his shell and find the courage to face an audience. "How am I going to do this?" Ethan muttered to himself late one night. He sat at the kitchen table, staring at the bills that had piled up. As he flipped through the mail, he found a letter from the National Junior Mathematics Competition Board. He tore it open with shaky hands. The letter congratulated John on qualifying, but also detailed the costs, registration fees, travel expenses, and the requirement to attend a pre-competition seminar. How on earth am I supposed to afford this? Ethan thought, sinking into his chair. Just then, John shuffled into the kitchen, clutching his notebook. He sat down at the table and began drawing patterns on a blank page. Ethan watched his son, his heart swelling with a mixture of love and despair. John looked up, catching his father's eye for a fleeting moment. "We need money for the competition," John said, his voice almost mechanical. Ethan blinked, startled that John had picked up on the situation. "Yeah, we do, buddy," Ethan replied, trying to sound hopeful. "But don't worry about that. I'll figure something out." He forced a smile, though his mind was racing. But how? He thought to himself. Later that week, Ethan took on extra shifts at a nearby construction site, leaving John with his grandparents. Robert and Margaret were pillars of support, but they were also getting older. their own finances stretched thin. "We'll do what we can, son," Robert told Ethan one afternoon. "But you know we're not exactly swimming in cash ourselves," Ethan nodded, appreciating his father's honesty. He felt as if they were all standing on the edge of a cliff, with only John's talent offering a potential way forward. In a moment of desperation, Ethan decided to approach the local community for support. He had never been the type to ask for help, but for John, he would do anything. He went to the town council meeting, taking a deep breath before stepping up to the microphone. His voice trembled as he spoke. "My son, John, has been given an incredible opportunity to compete in a national mathematics competition," he began, glancing nervously around the room. "But we need some help to make it happen. He's an incredible kid, and he's been through a lot. This chance means the world to him, to us." The response was mixed. While some of the council members expressed sympathy and promised to consider ways to assist, others were less enthusiastic. "We can't just hand out money," one member said. "There are other kids with talents and needs too. It wouldn't be fair." Ethan left the meeting with a sinking feeling in his stomach. They were running out of time and options. Back home, John was in his usual spot at the kitchen table, meticulously working through a complex equation. He glanced up when Ethan walked in, his eyes searching his father's face. "Did you get the money?" John asked bluntly. Ethan forced a smile. "Not yet, but we're not giving up," he replied, ruffling his son's hair. Days turned into weeks, and Ethan's anxiety grew. The registration deadline was closing in. Then, one evening, a knock came at the door. Ethan opened it to find Mr. Reynolds, their elderly neighbor, standing there with a small creased envelope in his hands. "I heard about John's competition," Mr. Reynolds said, his eyes kind yet firm. "Emily was a dear friend of mine. I know she would have wanted him to have this chance." He pressed the envelope into Ethan's hands and left without another word. Ethan opened it to find a modest sum of money inside, along with a note that simply read, "For John, with love." Ethan stood in the doorway, tears welling up in his eyes. It wasn't enough to cover everything, but it was a start. Word spread through the community. Slowly, more envelopes began to arrive at their doorstep. Small donations came from neighbors, local shop owners, and even John's school teachers. Each contribution was accompanied by words of encouragement, lifting Ethan's spirits and reminding him that they were not alone in this journey. The support gave him the strength to keep pushing forward. John noticed the change in his father, the determination that replaced the worry lines on his face. He couldn't fully grasp the nuances of their struggle, but he sensed that things were shifting in a positive direction. With the money finally coming together, Ethan registered John for the national competition and booked their travel. But the real challenge was yet to come. As the day of the pre-competition seminar approached, Ethan noticed John growing more withdrawn. The boy would sit silently at the kitchen table, staring blankly at his math problems, his hands fidgeting with his pencil. "What's wrong, buddy?" Ethan asked gently. John hesitated, then mumbled, "I don't want to go." Ethan's heart sank. He knelt beside his son, looking into his eyes. "I know you're scared," he said softly, "and it's okay to be, but you've worked so hard for this. I'm going to be right there with you, every step of the way. You don't have to face this alone." John glanced at his father, the tiniest glimmer of hope appearing in his eyes. Ethan hugged him tightly. "We'll take it one step at a time, all right? We'll do this together." As they prepared for the journey to the seminar, both Ethan and John braced themselves for what lay ahead. It wasn't just about math anymore. It was about overcoming every obstacle that stood in their way. Little did they know, this was just the beginning of the toughest trial they would ever face. The pre-competition seminar took place in a large auditorium at a university across the state. It was the first time John had traveled so far from the comfort of their small town. Ethan kept a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder as they walked through the bustling campus, trying to project confidence despite his own nervousness. John held his notebook close to his chest, his eyes darting around anxiously as he took in the new environment. As they entered the building, they were greeted by a sea of students and parents, each dressed in their best attire. Many of them seemed to know each other, chatting and laughing easily. John, however, retreated into himself, avoiding eye contact and keeping his gaze fixed on the ground. Ethan sensed the discomfort in his son, tightening his grip on John's shoulder. "Remember, buddy," he whispered, bending down to meet John's eyes, "this is just another place to do what you love. Focus on the numbers, not the people." The seminar began with introductions and an overview of the competition's rules. John sat silently among the other students, his hands nervously tapping on his notebook. Ethan could see the tension in his son's posture, his body stiff and ready to flee at any moment. Then came the team activities, designed to help the participants get to know each other and work collaboratively on math problems. It was here that the first real challenge arose. The students were divided into groups, and John was placed with 3 other children around his age. As the group leader, a girl named Sarah, began delegating tasks, John simply stared at his notebook, avoiding any interaction. "Hey, John, right?" Sarah asked, her voice bright but cautious. "Can you help us with this equation?" John nodded slightly, his eyes scanning the numbers before him. However, when he finally spoke, it was in fragmented sentences. "This, here, multiply, no, subtract," he mumbled, his voice growing quieter with each word. The other students exchanged glances, confused by his communication style. One of them, a boy named Alex, sighed loudly. "Does he even know what he's doing?" Alex muttered to another student, not bothering to lower his voice. Ethan watched from the sidelines, his heart sinking as he saw John's face turn pale. He wanted to rush in and defend his son, to shield him from the unkindness and misunderstanding. But he knew he had to let John try to navigate this on his own. This was part of the struggle they had to overcome. After several awkward moments, John managed to complete the problem on his own, scribbling the solution on the paper without waiting for the others' input. "There," he said quietly, pushing the paper towards Sarah. She examined it, her eyes widening in surprise. This is right," she exclaimed, looking at John with newfound respect. "That's amazing, John." But by then, John had already withdrawn into his shell, rocking slightly in his seat as he avoided the gazes around him. Ethan took a deep breath, both relieved and pained. It was a small victory, overshadowed by the struggle to fit in. The rest of the seminar continued in a similar manner. John excelled at solving problems but remained isolated, an enigma to the other children who didn't understand his mannerisms or his difficulty with communication. During breaks, Ethan would take him outside for fresh air, allowing him to decompress. They sat on a bench under a tree, Ethan rubbing his tired eyes as he considered their next steps. "We'll get through this," he assured John, though doubt gnawed at him. "You're doing great, buddy. Don't let what others say get to you." John nodded, but his eyes remained glued to the notebook in his hands, his fingers tracing invisible patterns on the cover. Ethan could sense the storm brewing inside his son's mind, the confusion, the frustration, and the fear. It was a battle Ethan knew too well. For years they had navigated life together, avoiding situations where John felt overwhelmed or out of place. But now, they were confronting those fears head-on, and it was tearing Ethan apart to watch his son struggle so much. As they returned to the auditorium, a woman approached them. She introduced herself as Miss Hawthorne, one of the competition's coordinators. "I've been watching John," she said kindly, offering a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "He's got a remarkable talent, but he seems to have some difficulties with communication and teamwork." Ethan stiffened, bracing himself for the inevitable lecture about the competition's demands. "I know," he replied, choosing his words carefully. "John's autistic. Working with others isn't easy for him, but he's incredibly gifted with numbers. We're here to help him grow, to challenge him." Miss Hawthorne nodded sympathetically. "I understand," she said softly, "but the national competition is more than just solving problems. It's about collaboration and presentation skills. I just want you to be prepared for that." Ethan forced a smile, even as frustration boiled within him. "We'll manage," he replied curtly. Miss Hawthorne gave a slight nod and walked away, leaving Ethan standing there with his thoughts racing. More obstacles, he thought bitterly. Ooh, why does it always have to be this hard? The journey back home was quiet. John sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window, his expression unreadable. Ethan glanced at him, searching for some sign of how he was feeling. "How are you doing, buddy?" he asked cautiously. John shrugged, not taking his eyes off the passing scenery. "Numbers are easy," he murmured. "The people are hard." Ethan's grip tightened on the steering wheel, his heart aching at his son's simple yet profound words. "I know, son," he replied, fighting back tears. "But sometimes we have to do the hard things to show the world what we're capable of." John turned to look at him, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. "I want to win," he said quietly. "For you." Ethan swallowed the lump in his throat, nodding slowly. "Then we'll do whatever it takes," he promised. "We'll practice, we'll prepare, and we'll face whatever comes our way." From that day on, their training intensified. Ethan began coaching John not just on math problems, but on how to handle social interactions. They role-played conversations, practiced eye contact, and worked through different scenarios that might arise during the competition. It was exhausting, both physically and emotionally, but Ethan refused to give up. Each small step forward, every moment of progress, was a victory in itself. However, they soon encountered another roadblock. As the competition drew closer, the costs began to mount. The travel expenses were more than Ethan had anticipated, and he realized with a sinking heart that they were running low on funds. Despite the community's earlier support, they were still short. Ethan found himself once again facing the harsh reality of their situation. He took on extra shifts, working late into the night and coming home exhausted, only to wake up early to train with John. It was wearing him down, but he pushed through, driven by the love he had for his son. One evening, as they sat at the table reviewing their dwindling savings, John looked up and asked, "Why is it so hard, Dad?" Ethan sighed, rubbing his temples. "Because the things worth having don't come easy," he replied. "But we're not going to let that stop us, are we?" John shook his head, his eyes reflecting a mixture of fear and determination. "No," he said firmly, "we're not." The weeks that followed became a blur of preparation, sacrifice, and struggle. Ethan pushed himself to the brink, juggling extra shifts, managing their household, and ensuring John had every opportunity to practice for the competition. It was a difficult balance, with both father and son facing exhaustion. John worked through complex problems late into the night, his focus unwavering, even as fatigue clouded his eyes. Ethan knew they were pushing their limits, but they had come too far to stop now. One evening, as they sat together at the kitchen table, Ethan noticed something different about John. His usual intensity toward his math problems was missing. Instead, he sat staring blankly at a sheet of paper, his pencil idle in his hand. "You okay, buddy?" Ethan asked gently, concern lining his voice. John didn't answer at first. His fingers tapped the edge of the table rhythmically, a sign that he was deep in thought or struggling with something. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "What if I can't do it?" The words hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. John had always been so focused, so determined. To hear doubt in his voice now was almost unbearable. Ethan took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "It's okay to be scared, John. This is a big challenge, and it's normal to feel unsure. But you've worked so hard, and I've seen what you can do. No matter what happens, you've already accomplished more than most people ever will." John looked up, his eyes searching his father's face for reassurance. "But people? They look at me and they don't think I can do it. They don't see me, just the autism." Ethan felt a pang in his chest, the familiar anger rising at the injustice his son faced every day. "You're right," Ethan replied, his voice thick with emotion. "A lot of people don't understand you, and that's their loss. But this isn't about them. It's about you, about proving to yourself that you're capable. You don't have to be like everyone else to succeed. You just have to be you." John's eyes shone with a mixture of fear and resolve. He nodded slowly and picked up his pencil, turning back to the sheet of problems. Ethan watched him for a moment, pride swelling in his heart. Whatever happened at the competition, he knew they were ready to face it. When the day of the competition finally arrived, the atmosphere was electric. The auditorium was filled with bright lights, banners, and the excited buzz of participants and their families. Ethan and John walked through the crowded hallways, John clutching his notebook tightly to his chest. His eyes flicked around the room, taking in the overwhelming scene. Ethan placed a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder. "Just remember, it's you and the numbers, buddy. Nothing else matters." They took their seats in the large auditorium, surrounded by competitors from all over the country. John's hands shook slightly as he pulled out his pencil, his eyes fixed on the stage where the competition would soon begin. Ethan watched him closely, ready to step in if things became too much. But he also knew that this was John's battle to fight. The first round was a written test, designed to eliminate half of the participants. John worked through the problem steadily, his eyes glued to the paper, his pencil moving in rapid strokes. Ethan held his breath as he watched from the sidelines, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and hope. He could see other parents and students occasionally glancing at John, some with curiosity, others with skepticism. He ignored them, focusing solely on his son. When the results of the first round were announced, Ethan felt his stomach twist into knots. The names were called out one by one, and time seemed to stretch into eternity. Finally, the announcer said, "John Parker." Ethan let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. John looked up, his eyes wide with surprise and a flicker of pride. Ethan smiled and gave him a thumbs up. "You did it, buddy," he whispered. "On to the next round." The second round was the real test, a live problem-solving stage where participants had to explain their answers in front of a panel of judges and an audience. Ethan knew this was where things would get difficult for John. Public speaking and interacting with strangers had always been his greatest challenge. As John stepped up to the stage, Ethan could see the tension in his posture, the way his hands trembled as he gripped the marker. The panel presented the problem, a complex series of equations that required not only quick thinking, but also clear communication of the solution. John stared at the board, his eyes darting over the numbers. For a moment, he stood frozen, his mind racing as the audience's murmurs grew louder. Ethan felt his heart break as he watched his son struggle, knowing the anxiety that gripped him. "Come on, buddy," he whispered under his breath, willing John to find the strength he needed. Then, something extraordinary happened. John took a deep breath and began to speak, his voice shaky at first, but gaining strength as he went on. "First, you isolate the variables," he explained, his eyes fixed on the board. His sentences were fragmented, his speech halting, but the math was flawless. He moved through each step with precision, drawing lines and numbers across the board, in a dance only he seemed to understand. The audience fell silent, their initial skepticism giving way to awe as they realized they were witnessing something remarkable. When John finished, he turned to the judges, his eyes wide with uncertainty. The room was still for a moment, then erupted into applause. Ethan felt tears spring to his eyes as he watched his son stand there, a mixture of relief and disbelief on his face. One of the judges, a stern-looking woman in glasses, stood up and spoke into the microphone. "That was an outstanding solution, John. Well done." John blinked, as if unsure that he had really heard the words. Then slowly, a small smile spread across his face, a smile of triumph, of victory over every obstacle that had stood in his way. He walked off the stage, his steps a bit steadier, his head held a little higher. Ethan met him halfway, pulling him into a tight hug. "I'm so proud of you," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "You did it," but the competition wasn't over yet. There was one final round, a head-to-head match with the top 3 participants. As they waited for the round to begin, Ethan noticed a familiar face among the crowd, Miss Hawthorne, the competition coordinator. She approached them, a soft smile on her face. "John, you've already proven something incredible today," she said kindly. "No matter what happens in this final round, know that you've accomplished more than anyone could have expected." John nodded, his eyes focused and determined. "I want to win," he said simply, echoing the words he had spoken to his father weeks before. Ethan squeezed his shoulder. "Then give it everything you've got, buddy. No matter the outcome, you've already won in my eyes." The final round was brutal. The problems were intricate, designed to push the participants to their limits. John's competitors were older and more experienced, but he faced each problem with unyielding determination. As the final problem appeared on the screen, the room held its breath. It was a complex equation, one that required a deep understanding of advanced mathematics. John stared at it, his mind whirling. He glanced at his father, who nodded encouragingly. "Focus, buddy, you can do this." Slowly, methodically, John began to work through the problem, his pencil flying across the paper. His competitors were struggling, whispering to themselves as they tried to make sense of the numbers. But John seemed to enter a trance. his focus so intense that everything else faded away. When he finally finished, he looked up, his eyes locking with the judge's. The room was silent as the judges reviewed his work. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, every second stretching into eternity. Then the head judge stood up, clearing his throat. The winner of this year's National Junior Mathematics Competition is John Parker. The room erupted in applause, cheers filling the auditorium. Ethan felt his knees go weak, tears streaming down his face as he watched his son stand there, blinking in stunned disbelief. John turned to look at his father, a single tear rolling down his cheek. "We did it," he whispered. "We really did it." Ethan rushed forward, wrapping his son in a hug, overwhelmed with pride, love, and gratitude. "You did it, John," he said, his voice breaking. "You showed them all what you're made of." As they stood there, surrounded by applause and celebration, Ethan realized that this victory was more than just a win in a competition. It was a testament to their journey, to the obstacles they had overcome together, to the strength they had found in each other. And for the first time in years, he felt a profound sense of peace. They had faced the impossible, and they had won. The auditorium was still buzzing with excitement as John and Ethan made their way off the stage, clutching the trophy. The once skeptical faces of the audience members had transformed into admiration and respect. John had not just won a math competition, he had shattered every preconceived notion about his abilities, proving that his talent and determination were more significant than any label or limitation society placed on him. For Ethan, it was a moment that felt like a dream. All the late nights, sacrifices, and battles they had fought together had culminated in this victory. As they headed toward the exit, they were stopped by Mr. Hawthorne. Her eyes were bright with admiration as she extended her hand. "John, you've done something incredible today," she said warmly. "Your performance wasn't just about solving problems. It was about showing us all the power of resilience and determination." John nodded, gripping the trophy tightly as he processed her words. He didn't speak, but his eyes shone with pride and understanding. Ethan watched the interaction with a smile. He had seen his son grow so much throughout this journey, not just as a mathematician, but as a person. The child who once shied away from any interaction now stood, trophy in hand, facing the world with newfound courage. It wasn't just the competition that had changed, it was John. The victory was more than a medal or a trophy, it was a transformation. As they walked out into the brisk evening air, Ethan felt a surge of emotions. His phone buzzed in his pocket, and he glanced at the screen to see an incoming call from his parents, Robert and Margaret. With a smile, he answered. "He won," Ethan announced, unable to keep the joy out of his voice. Margaret's voice came through, choked with tears. "Oh, thank heavens, we knew he could do it. Please tell him we're so proud of him." Ethan held the phone up to John's ear, and John listened, his face softening as his grandparents showered him with praise. After a moment, he whispered, "Thank you." It was simple, but it spoke volumes. As they headed back to their hotel room that night, Ethan couldn't stop looking at his son. He saw the exhaustion in his eyes, the quiet reflection that suggested John was replaying the day's events in his mind. He wondered what his son was thinking, what emotions were coursing through him after such a monumental accomplishment. "Proud of you, buddy," Ethan said softly, reaching over to ruffle John's hair. "You proved everyone wrong." John looked up at his father, his eyes tired yet filled with a quiet triumph. "It's not about proving them wrong," he replied, his voice steady. "It's about showing what I can do." Ethan paused, feeling a swell of emotion at his son's words. "You're right," he agreed. "You've shown everyone, including yourself, just how incredible you are." The days after the competition brought a whirlwind of changes. News of John's victory spread quickly, turning him into a local hero. The school that had once dismissed him as a special case now held an assembly in his honor, acknowledging his achievements with a plaque and a scholarship offer. The school principal, who had once questioned John's ability to keep up with traditional education, personally apologized to Ethan. "We misjudged him," she admitted. "John is a remarkable student, and we're committed to supporting his growth from now on." Ethan accepted the gesture graciously, but couldn't help the pang of bitterness that lingered. For years, he and John had faced doubt, skepticism, and outright discrimination. Now, with a trophy in hand, people suddenly saw value in his son. It wasn't fair, but it was the reality they had fought against. He realized that John's journey was far from over. This victory was just one battle in a lifetime of challenges they would face. In the following weeks, John was approached by a prestigious math academy that offered him a full scholarship. Ethan was torn. It was an incredible opportunity, but it would mean sending John away to live on campus. Could his son handle the change? Could he, as a father, bear to let him go? When he discussed the offer with John, his son listened quietly, staring at the brochure for the academy. "Do you want to go?" Ethan asked gently, his heart in his throat. John looked up, his expression thoughtful. "I want to learn more," he said simply. "But I don't want to leave you." Ethan felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes. "Buddy," he began, his voice trembling, "and I want you to have every opportunity to grow and explore what you love. If this is what you want, I'll support you. I'll always be here for you, no matter where you are." John nodded slowly, processing his father's words. "I'm scared," he admitted, his voice barely audible. "I know," Ethan replied, pulling his son into a tight hug. "It's okay to be scared, but remember, you've already overcome so much. If you can do that, you can handle anything that comes your way." After much consideration, they decided to visit the academy together before making any decisions. Ethan made arrangements for them to spend a weekend on campus, hoping it would help John adjust to the idea. The academy was impressive, with state-of-the-art facilities and a faculty that immediately recognized John's talent. They offered special accommodations tailored to his needs, ensuring that he would have a support system in place. During their tour, they met Dr. Keller, a professor specializing in mathematics education for neurodiverse students. He greeted John warmly, immediately engaging him in a conversation about complex mathematical theories. To Ethan's surprise, John responded more comfortably than he had in any of their previous encounters with strangers. It was as if, surrounded by numbers and people who understood his unique way of thinking, John found a piece of the world where he truly belonged. Ethan watched from the sidelines, his heart swelling with pride and a bittersweet sense of loss. He knew that John was on the cusp of a new chapter in his life, one that would take him farther from the safety of their small town and the routines they had built together. It hurt to think of his son living away from home, but it also filled him with hope. John was finding his place in the world, and that was all Ethan had ever wanted for him. When they returned home, Ethan sat John down for a final conversation about the decision. "It's your choice, buddy," he said, his voice steady. "If you want to go to the academy, I'll support you. If you want to stay, we'll find other ways to keep learning together." John looked at him, his eyes clear and determined. "I want to go," he said firmly. "I want to learn more, and I want to show that I can do it." Ethan nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "Then we'll make it happen," he promised. "And I'll be there every step of the way, even if it's from a distance." As the months passed, they prepared for John's transition to the academy. Ethan found comfort in the knowledge that his son was stepping into a place where his talents would be nurtured and his challenges understood. The day he dropped John off at the academy was one of the hardest of his life, but as he hugged his son goodbye, he felt a deep sense of pride. "I love you, buddy," he whispered. "Go show the world what you're made of." John hugged him back, his grip tight and strong. "I love you too, Dad," he replied, "and I will." Watching his son walk into the academy, Ethan felt a wave of emotions wash over him: sadness, joy, fear, and above all, hope. He knew there would be more battles ahead, more challenges to face, but he also knew that together, they had built a foundation of strength and love that could withstand anything. John's journey was far from over, but as Ethan drove away from the academy, he realized that they had already won the most important victory of all, the victory of believing in oneself, despite the world's doubts and prejudices. Back at home, Ethan sat down at their kitchen table, the place where it had all begun. He looked at the now worn stack of practice problems and felt a smile tug at the corners of his mouth. The road ahead was unknown, but for the first time he felt at peace with it. They had faced the impossible, and they had triumphed. Now, they were ready for whatever came next. If John's story touched your heart, please give this video a like and share it with others who might need a reminder that anything is possible with determination and love. Subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell to stay updated on more inspiring stories. And remember to check out our other videos. There's a world of incredible stories waiting for you.